I was going over, we got the draft coming up in about a month from now that we have turned the calendar officially to the month of April. That is what is next on the NFL docket. So I want to take a look at where the Eagles kind of stand as a overall 53-man roster. I know there's more than 53, but obviously, when you take a look at some things, and John McMullen, it feels like some things are starting to kind of take some shape, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. I guess they still need some linebacker help. But when you do like an overview of Jim Schwartz's defense right now, it seems like the secondary, Darby's gone. Seems like it's kind of taking some place in the secondary there a little bit. The linebacking spot would obviously be the big weakness. But other than linebacker, if they were still targeting defense in the draft, what spot is that?
Probably edge rusher. They could use another edge rusher. I think every team could use another edge rusher in this league. And certainly, the Eagles like to use a rotational system. Vinny Curry's still out there, still hasn't signed, but not necessarily. Obviously, they want to go younger. And to have some players coming back. Joe Osman's coming back. People don't think about him. He was going to have a role on this team last season, and then he tore his ACL. They also traded for Jannard Avery and didn't get him involved midseason, but obviously gave up pretty significant pick for him and think he can be some kind of contributor at least down the road. So they have some options, but you're always looking to improve every position, and that would be the next one on my list. But they also still need, as well, depending to talk about Rasul Douglas on the trade market, for instance. They want to go in a different direction at the cornerback position. You need depth there, even with the guys they signed, and safety as well. I mean, you can't. A lot of talk about Jalen Mills this week because he talked to us on a conference call yesterday. Eagles have a lot of confidence in him. We know how much Jim Schwartz likes him. All that is real, but I wouldn't be completely comfortable with that assumption that he's going to be able to immediately contribute in a similar fashion as Malcolm Jenkins and even Will Parks. I mean, I don't know why people are so excited about him, but you look at the contract and it's evident that it is what it is. 1 year, 1.6, 1.7 million, something about that. People weren't knocking down his door. That's not a proven player. So I still think they still have some question marks at safety as well.
Yeah, John, and to go to the Will Parks, I guess, he was on the radio with us. He's been very vocal. I guess if you hear the young man talk, you do get kind of excited about what he, can bring to a locker room, at least. I don't know what kind of player he might be. I mean, we had Nick Ferguson on from Denver earlier in last week, and he said he thought that Parks doesn't get enough credit for the type of player that he is and that we will be pleasantly surprised. That's neither here nor there. But I think it goes to Parks' personality. He seems like he's going to be the kind of guy that's a fan favorite.
Well, yeah, and he's from Philadelphia, and he left a little bit more money on the table to come back to Philadelphia. So I think that is also a check mark in his favor with the fans. And he has been versatile, and the Eagles have gone off into this positionless player narrative when it comes to the back seven, looking for guys who can line up in different spots. So he's done that in the past. He's played strong safety, free safety, nickel, corner, dime. He's done a lot of different things in Denver, but yeah, I mean, it's, and that's what free agency is. You project, you evaluate, but I will say, and I say this a lot, look, contracts are not the be all end all, but they do tell you something. And if the Eagles envisioned him, and I'm not picking on him, you could say the same thing about Jatavis Brown, somebody like that. If they pictured him as a starter or a potential starter, he'd have a 3-4 year deal. He's on a 1 year deal for a reason, and that's a prove-it deal by nature. And that's what he's got to do. He's got to come out and prove he can contribute.
All right. When I look at the secondary, and I wrote a piece about this over at the website, as of right now, I would expect the depth chart to be Slay and Sidney Jones as your outside corners, Nickel Roby-Coleman as your slot, Mills and McLeod as your two safeties. Is that how you view it, with the reserve role of Will Parks, Avonte Maddox, Rasul Douglas, if he's still here, and Kervon LeBlanc?
Well, I would say one change. I would say one, we do line up, and hopefully we do line up for training camp. But we had that conversation yesterday. I think Avonte Maddox would be ahead of Sidney Jones on the outside, opposite Darius Slay. I think there's still hope, more so from Howie Roseman than Jim Schwartz, to be honest, that Sidney Jones develops and seizes that role. But he's going to have to beat out Avonte Maddox. And we've talked about Avonte in the past, and there's some significant size deficiencies, and that's why he's always projected in the slot. But Howie specifically brought up some players like Aaron Glenn and I think even Darrell Green about shorter guys who excelled outside. And when Avonte's been forced to do that, he's done it well. And I think once they got Nickel Roby-Coleman, which I think was a pleasant surprise, I think they shifted gears and they say, let's get our best players on the field. To date, Avonte's been a much better player than Sidney Jones. So Sidney's going to have to earn that job.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and I know that you would probably like to speak to this, that, Sidney Jones apparently is working out with some, renowned guy that a lot of corners work out with. And, there is some hope that maybe he'll be healthy, and that if he is healthy and finally in his fourth season, can become the guy that a lot of people thought Sidney Jones was going to be a top 15 pick.
Not a lot. I mean, everybody. He was consensus top 15 pick.
Right, so you wonder what has held him back. Has it been more of the injuries or more that he just can't play at this level?
I think a lot of it is the injuries, but there is some to do with the fact that he's not physical enough when he has been out there. And I go back to that Peter King column when he was in Sean Payton, allowed him to become embedded in his game planning. If you remember that column, he wrote when the Eagles were playing the Saints and they targeted 22, which is Sidney Jones, I think twice in the first 7 plays. And they said he wasn't going to hold up. And at the time he was playing nickel corner, and he was 100% right. First play of the game, they ran right at Sidney Jones and busted off a long run, and he got hurt. He couldn't hold up physically, and that's the hill he's got to climb, because I've mentioned it a lot. I mean, Howie's like every other GM. They're all the same. They want their high-level premium picks to succeed, and they're going to get opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. But if you look at Sidney Jones and where he was on this team last year, Jim Schwartz has a different take on it. And even when he was playing very sparingly, and he was making plays, you remember he had that little stretch where he'd get in for a play and make a pass breakup.
They were in the playoffs or late in the year, yeah.
Exactly. But he still wouldn't put him in there. He wouldn't put him in there. He only put him in there when he was absolutely forced to. And there was a time when he benched him for Craig James, who was on the street, and the Eagles brought in. So he was in the doghouse, and he's got a lot of things to prove to the guy who is making decisions on whether he plays or not. And it just as I said, it is a big, big hill for him to climb. And Avonte's way ahead of him right now.
John, who has the most pressure from an individual standpoint riding on them on the defensive side of the ball?
Well, I think Jalen does, to be honest, because of who he's replacing and what Malcolm has done for this defense, this team, this city, even more so. And the type of personality he was, not only on the field from a leadership perspective, but off the field, in the locker room. I mean, that is a big statured player. And you're not only being asked to replace him, you're being asked to replace him after moving positions. I mean, and that's why I said, the Eagles, from their perspective, and you could either look at this as positive or negative, I mean, they seem not even concerned that Jalen can do this. And to be honest, from my standpoint, I'm a little bit surprised. I mean, they're acting like it's not that big of a deal. And I just think there's going to be immense pressure. And you think about it in sports in general, no matter the sport, no matter the position, you don't want to replace the legend. And maybe that's too big of a term for Malcolm Jenkins. I don't think he's that good, but you get the point. You don't want to replace that guy. You want to be the guy who replaces the guy who replaced the stalwart, the 3-time Pro Bowl selection. Because generally it doesn't work out well for the next guy. And the Eagles, hey, like I said, you can look at it positively or negatively. They seem to be very confident Jalen can do it. I'm not as confident.
So what happens? Let's play the hypothetical negative game here for a second. What happens if it doesn't work out with Jalen Mills at safety? Then what? And what does that mean for the defense?
Well, and that's where Will Parks would come in. So you could argue at least they have a backup plan. I just mentioned his versatility. He's played different positions. But what I was just kind of saying to Mike as well, I mean, and I know you guys had somebody on from Denver and said he was underrated, and that's fine. But, I mean, the reality is he wasn't a full-time starter. The reality is he got a one-year deal for $1.6 million. It's not like there aren't 31 other teams looking at these players as well. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say contracts are not the be-all, end-all, but they do tell you certain things. So, I mean, to me, it says he's probably a solid backup player and a good special teams player. And if all of a sudden that turns into starting strong safety who's got to replace Malcolm Jenkins, it's probably not going to work out well.
Johnny Mac, we're looking on the defensive side of the ball as free agency period comes to a close. The Eagles made a lot of changes. We'll get to that linebacker. You mentioned edge. Would you put Derek Barnett in a Sidney Jones? I mean, he's had more success than Jones, but would you say that he has been a success as a guy they traded up to pick? Ryan asked you about a guy who has a lot of pressure. Is this time for Derek Barnett to kind of find out, do we know who he is? Do we know what he is? I mean, is he a wild card kind of guy?
Yeah, I think he's a little bit of a wild card kind of guy because he had some injury issues as well. Not nearly to what Sidney had, but he's been a productive player at times. But he hasn't lived up to the billing as the 14th pick in the draft as someone who's going to be a double-digit sack guy. And I think that's what people were hoping for. That's ultimately what you're always hoping for when you're talking about a top 15 pick as an edge rusher. I mean, that's what you want. You want a double-digit guy, and he hasn't been that. So I think he's far from a bust, but I think it's far from a certainty either at this stage. So this is a big season, no question about it, for Derek Barnett. A lot of people have talked about Ndakwe, about already going out and trying to get another edge rusher. Well, I got news for it. The Eagles make that move. Barnett's the third defensive end. Then you can start saying, well, that's not living up to the billing as a top-level first-round pick. Yeah. So, yeah, there's still a lot of question marks surrounding Derek Barnett, but certainly not to the level of Sidney Jones.
Well, are you following Josina Anderson's eyes cross dot. Well, that there could be something coming here?
That has more to do with Ndakwe. In fact, that he's trying to pull a Stephon Diggs on social media. And every time he does it, he's talking about the Eagles. So clearly he wants to come here. Clearly he thinks the Eagles have an interest Jason Lockton. 4 is another one. A lot, Howie's reputation, which, by the way, hasn't slowed down, even though he didn't do much over this past year. He always had this reputation as being ultra aggressive, but he has said pretty consistently, we're in a different phase from a roster building perspective. He's got to get younger. He needs more picks, and he's been true to that. But he's also, when something does get presented in front of him, Darius Slay being the most notable example. They weren't able to get Byron Jones. They weren't able to get Chris Harris. They had to get a corner, so they had to go on the trade market to get a good corner. So he's still willing to do it, but I think people always default to, well, the Eagles are going to make a move, because that's how they were always viewed, and that's how half of these rumors get started.
Right now, we talk about the kind of the edge rushing spot here. You got Graham, you got Barnett. You mentioned Osman as a guy that no one really remembers and thinks about. But I remember last year you thinking that he was going to have a big role in this defense. Do you think that I don't want to say big role, but that he was going to have a role that we'll never know? But do you anticipate that they have plans for him to be a big part of this defense?
No, I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, first you have to see how he's coming off the torn ACL. That's a significant injury, and for a guy who relied on speed, I mean, that's Joe's game. People probably don't realize it because they haven't seen him a lot, but he's undersized. He was a great pass rusher in college. Eagles were working him in that Joker package that they tried very, very briefly with Jannard Avery, and that would be a stand-up rusher in the nickel from the inside because of his speed, his explosiveness, his quickness. That's the role they were working on. And that's from Jim. I mean, that's from the top. I mean, he was going to have a role on that pass rushing unit. How much of a role? I think that would have depended on the success or lack thereof. And I think in a large part he gets sort of don't pass go and gets knocked back because of the injury. He's got to prove himself again, and there's going to be other bodies involved, Avery being one of them. And at some point in the draft, might be early, might be late, but they're going to bring in other bodies as well.
Where would you say right now, would you say that the defensive tackle spot is a strength with Fletcher, Malik Jackson, and obviously bringing in Hargrave? Would you look at that as, hey, that's the strength of this defense right now?
Yeah, no question. And, they also brought back Hassan Ridgeway. Interesting, Tim Jernigan just signed with Houston today. But obviously the Eagles didn't have a role for Tim any longer, and the injuries kind of derailed his career here. But the one thing you have to question is how do you handle the rotation? Because Fletcher and Hargrave are obviously going to be the starters, but Malik Jackson came in here last year with starter money, starter mentality. Is he going to accept a far more limited role? But on paper, if you're just looking at it that way and not bringing in the human effect, I mean, that's as deep as it gets at defensive tackle in this league from a talent standpoint. When you talk about those three guys and Ridgeway, and you don't even talk about Anthony Rush, who was forced into action last year, played pretty well. So they have plenty of depth there as well. Bruce Hector got some experience. So, yeah, that would be certainly on paper maybe their deepest position.
I do want to – you mentioned Jernigan. He signed with the Texans today. You mentioned the injuries kind of derailed him. I remember they made the trade for him back before 17. They swapped the third-round picks. They got him. And then the injuries, he had the broken foot. He had, a herniated disc in his back. The Eagles had signed him to a pretty big deal at one point, like a 4-year extension that he never ended up getting too much of because of the injury issues. But, he was a guy that when he was on the field, I mean, even this year, he had 10 games. He ended up with 2 sacks. He had 10 tackles, 3 behind the line of scrimmage. It seemed that when Jernigan played, he was a pretty good player. It's unfortunate that the injuries, he just could not stay on the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look back, I think it was the first 7 games. I think it was 7 games after the trade, his first season in Philadelphia. He was great. And then he hurt his ankle, and the Eagles still signed him to the big money extension because he had played so well early that season. Looked like the perfect complement to Fletcher Cox. And then, from there, he herniated that disc, lifting weights, which was on his own time. It wasn't at the facility. It was off season, so it was a non-football injury. And unfortunately, that's how tough this industry is, that essentially that contract was taken off the table. So just terrible timing from his standpoint. But, it ended up being 7 games, and you just got a taste of what it might have been like. But that's what the Eagles were searching for, and that's what they hope they have now. Even more so, I think, with Javon Hargrave, to have that complement who can push the pocket alongside Fletcher Cox. And that, more than anything else in the NFL, even edge rushers are valued more. But if you talk to quarterbacks, the thing that they hate the most is interior pressure right in their face, right up the middle. And if you have 2 of them, Eagles had it for a very short time with Cox and Jernigan. They tried to get it with Cox and Malik Jackson. Malik got hurt in the first game. And now they're trying it with Fletcher and Javon Hargrave. In theory, if they can get that, it would be huge for that defense.
All right, that's a look at where the Eagles stand on the defensive side of the ball after free agency here. I mean, would you be shocked? I mean, we didn't really talk about linebacker, which we could spend a whole hour on probably. They did bring in Jatavius Brown, but they don't have a whole heck of a lot else there. I mean, is that a spot that they can still look in free agency?
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly going to look to add somewhere. I mean, I can tell you from a personal standpoint, I have never been more viciously attacked than saying the Eagles think Nate Gary played competently last season, which they do. But for some reason, the fans really, really dislike Nate Gary. And right now, he's their best linebacker. So, I mean, you have to improve that position. And the Eagles, like Duke Riley, he was a trade pickup that didn't get much of an opportunity last year. They have T.J. Edwards, who's an undrafted free agent, Alex Singleton, who was a star in the CFL. But let's be honest, this isn't Dick Butkus. Let's put it that way. I mean, they need linebackers.
All right, so tomorrow we'll take a look on the offense. By the way, we're going to be talking with Wade Phillips tomorrow, the great defensive mind. So we talk defense today. We'll have Wade Phillips on tomorrow, and then we'll flip over to the offensive side of the ball, where the Eagles stand after the free agent period, leading into the draft, and we'll get those storylines tomorrow's Football at 4. All right, pal. Thanks, John.
Yeah, I got to ask Wade about Aaron Donald. Wait till you hear those stories, man.
I'm sure his name will come up. All right, pal. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, thanks, guys.
Yeah, tomorrow, Wade Phillips on the show at 3:15. Johnny Mack's back tomorrow at 4 for Football at 4. You heard the Eagles news today. Tim Jernigan, he signs with Houston. He gets it looks like a 1-year deal. He's been unfortunate. As John kind of chronicled, the injuries really derailed him. He's right. When Jernigan first got here, if you remember those first 4, 5, 6, 7 games, he was dominant player. He was awesome. He was sacking the quarterback from the tackle position, something that you don't see all that much. And then when he came back, he just wasn't the same player. And then he got the contract, and that went away. And the next thing you know, he was the Eagles declined the option on him. Then they brought him back last year. Like, wow, they were able to get rid of him and then bring him back. And he broke his foot last year in the game against the Falcons and never really made much of an impact.